Well, it's time for another edition of my Looking Back at Zack. Yes, the films of Zack Snyder. So he had a very strong debut with the remake of Dawn of the Dead. It's one of my favorite films, I believe. I certainly think it's, if not the best, it is one of the best zombie films. And then he follows that with another big hit in 300, which was an adaptation of Frank Miller's take on the legendary battle of the Spartans against the Persians. And it was all very well done, and the techniques, and really stretching out his abilities with that film. So, gee, what to do? Well, he'd adapted a Frank Miller project, so why not stick with the comic book route and adapt probably what is seen as one of the greatest comic book masterpieces ever made, if not the masterpiece, of course, Alan Moore's The Watchmen. Now, Alan Moore, of course, is hell-bent against any adaptations of it. He is furious with DC Comics. He believes they ripped him off. To a certain extent, he has an argument, but it's greatly overblown in a lot of ways, and some of his arguments about the whole idea of pursuing Watchmen and marketing it, and when they did prequels to it, and then now there's the Doomsday Clock, and which I gotta admit I kind of like. And the prequels, they were sort of okay, but best of all was Darwin Cook's Minutemen, which is pretty good. But at the same time, he's bellyaching about that while doing stories with characters that true or in the public domain, but they were characters created for a certain purpose by a specific artist, and now he's exploiting them for his League of Extraordinary Gentlemen tales, which is a pretty good little run that he did, because hell, the guy's talented. But Alan, what are you doing? So I guess his argument would be, well, I'm not dead yet, So yeah, the HBO series, I saw 2 episodes of it, and I was, are you kidding me? But the Zack Snyder adaptation of the original series, Watchmen, is about as close as you're going to get of being a loyal adaptation to that story. And, if I may be so bold, has a bit of an improvement on the original, as far as plot-wise. The plot was always more or less the weakest part of the whole thing. The best part about Watchmen was his achievements and its story structure, and this is all within the structure of comic books. A film is going to be very different. You can't really capture how the comic book did that, because it's a film. It's not a comic book. The film can use, the echoes and mirrors of imagery, which films do, and that sort of thing, but it's never quite going to capture it the way the comic book did. And that's unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. They're 2 totally different mediums, and so that's that. But that in and of itself is not an argument for not attempting the project. You end up coming up with something that's different. But the main things here was the ultimate plot of what the sinister plot of the villain is here, which was to save the world from itself. Watchmen, of course, is very much an 80s book, and 80s turns out was the twilight years of the Cold War, and the Cold War always had the monster shadow of a mushroom cloud hanging over it, and so this was end of the world stuff, and so that's the premise behind the world of Watchmen. And so the villain, who we were introduced to as a superhero, Ozymandias, his ultimate plot was to murder millions to save billions, so that he could force the United States and the Soviet Union to come together against a perceived common enemy, the idea being an alien invasion of some sort. And he's able to create this creature, some sort of squid-like creature that has psychic abilities or something like that. And it has this massive massacre, in certain strategic areas of the world and what have you. Well, it was a bit too much, a bit too ridiculous. One of the interesting ideas about it was that this was an adaptation of the Carlton characters of Captain Atom, who Dr. Manhattan is based on him. The Night Owl is based on the Blue Beetle, so on and so forth. And the thing about those was that Captain Atom was the only character who had superpowers. The rest were people who were just really good at fighting, and they wore these costumes. So this was applied here, and it makes sense to the idea of pushing it further possible into a realistic world, in that if anything like superpowers would happen to somebody, it would be 1 in a trillion event, you know. And so this happens to Dr. Manhattan. It's never going to happen again. And so there he is with all these godlike powers and everything. And so that's that. But that doesn't mean that because you have this super genius is going to be able to create an alien-like creature and pull this off. It's a bit much. And so what Zack Snyder did was basically, Ozymandias, instead of creating this creature, he frames Dr. Manhattan for the mass murder on a global scale. And so Dr. Manhattan becomes the monster that the world is afraid of. And at the same time, for this to work, Ozymandias has to gamble that he can convince Dr. Manhattan to keep his mouth shut, which he does, because he displays that this was the only way to prevent Armageddon. Of course, the real joke here is we know how the Cold War really ended, and he didn't need any of that. So Ozymandias is kind of an idiot. But, well, this is another universe, we'll say, as that goes. The other change that he did, that's most notable, is the scene that basically pushes the big star of Watchmen, which is the character of Rorschach, who was based on the Carlton character, The Question, by Steve Ditko. And they're very, very similar in a lot of ways in personality and whatnot. And but here, there's the scene where there's this little girl who gets kidnapped and murdered by a child killer. And so Rorschach, in the comic book, handcuffs him and leaves him a hacksaw, and then sets the place on fire. And if you want to free yourself, you got to saw your arm off. So the guy burns to death. Well, at the time, Snyder said, well, if we do that scene, we're going to be accused of ripping off the horror movie series Saw. Well, screw Saw. The original scene is much better, because this is an important scene in which Rorschach was already kind of nutty, but he really goes off the deep end when he's confronted with such horrific evil as a child killer. And so it's a very pivotal scene, but instead of killing him in that manner, he instead he grabs a hatchet or what have you, and beats him in the face with it and chops his head up. So it's the same result, of course, for Rorschach the character, but I mean, the way he's just, hey, I gave you a shot. You can saw your arm off, you can escape. But at the time, and that's the sad thing about it, at the time, as time goes by, depending on which movie you think is better, no one's really going to care. Besides, Watchmen did it first in the comic book. So, but anyway, that apparently was the motivation for changing that scene, which I don't really agree with. But overall, boy, did he work really hard on this one, and I think he achieved it as best as possibly could. There were other versions. I think Terry Gilliam was going to do one, and I've read some of the details of that, and that would have been awful. It was an entirely different story. At the end, they wake up in another world where their comic book characters are, I don't know, it's trying to be like Twilight Zone, I guess. I don't know, but this was a pretty a loyal adaptation as you can get. And I'm talking the full-on director's cut, which includes the animated pirate comic book story that also was weaved in through the story. And of course, there are extras where there's interviews with Hollis Mason and all that. There's a whole Watchmen experience that was done. And people crap on him, say he didn't get it or what have you. No, he did. The meat and bones is all there. The weakness of the plot, again, is that it's just an Outer Limits plot. Yeah, it was already done. I think that there could have been something else. But the characterizations and the stories and whatnot is all very much there. it hit harder at its time because there really wasn't much else like that at the time when the comic book came out. Before that, Alan Moore had done Miracle Man or Marvel Man, and just sort of pushing the superhero into the adult world and that sort of thing. And so that's probably had more of an impact than anything else. But then also there's all this layers and structure that he had done that, and for a movie, and really as a movie, you really need it as a collection on Blu-ray or DVD, what have you, where you got all these extra things that he shot for it, that tries to capture the different layers of the story that was told throughout the series. So I really enjoyed Zack Snyder's Watchmen. I like it. It's one of my favorite superhero movies. And it's one of the criticisms was that he added more action into it. There's action in Watchmen to show that they were capable. Someone suggested that they're supposed to look like Adam West characters and buffoons or whatnot, because of the costumes look too cool in Zack Snyder's version. But then this is the movie world and how movie superheroes look, and they're always in these rubber suits. Although the Minutemen, they're pretty much what they look like. Rorschach and Comedian look exactly what they look. They could walk right out of the comic book. Night Owl looks closer to Batman, and I think did a better outfit for Ozymandias than the one he has. But even Ozymandias is not quite Adam West looking. So I don't really get that argument to the point that they're supposed to be silly and ridiculous and that it was a condemnation of superheroes. It still is, because they're all messed up people. And it was kind of foolish what they were doing. And look what had happened. The ego and arrogance of Ozymandias just murders all these people. And we know it was all for nothing, because a war between the Soviet Union and the United States was not going to happen. But it's interesting, and that's more to the talent of Alan Moore, is it right? Because these days, Alan Moore is a hard left guy, but he was able to give a fully fleshed out right-wing character like Rorschach. And at the same time, the real villain is not Rorschach. It's Ozymandias, who is a hard left guy with his utopian visions and whatnot. And people are just not really people to him, is he? He sees himself as above it all. He's the quintessential philosopher king type aristocrat here. And so that's the kudos to Alan Moore's talent as a writer and skills and whatnot. But the idea that Snyder's take here is some sort of betrayal of Moore's vision and what have you, I just don't think so. And so there you go. I think he did a very good job. And this is quite a good run. His third film out, and he's still going strong, I think. Of course, the reception is divided and whatnot, but this is just my opinion, and it's the only one that matters. So there you go. As for other adaptions of Watchmen, in fact, I believe there was talk with Alan Moore at the time to do a prequel series based on the Minutemen, but it fell through when he got mad at him and all that. Eventually, we got Darwin Cook's Minutemen, which is actually very good. And it's too bad no one looked at that as a possible adaptation for a film or a series. And it's a funny thing about the HBO series, I originally thought that Watchmen would work much better as a miniseries for HBO, as a television thing rather than a film, because there's just so much to do. And Snyder did, well, especially with the Ultimate Collection, not the theatrical version, but with all the depth and layers and stories to tell in it, it had to be in this much longer version and, on Blu-ray. So, but still, I think a TV series would have done better. Unfortunately, that's not what we're getting. We're getting some other story that's just using the brand name of Watchmen to sell it. It's too bad, because I think if they were going to do something that wasn't going to be adaptation of the original, then they should have looked to Darwin Cook's Minutemen. I think that would have made a really great series or even a film. So, but it didn't happen that way. But as far as adaptions for a film of Watchmen, you won't do yourself any wrong by watching Zack Snyder's version of it. It's a very good achievement on his part. So, wow, what was next? Yes, next will be Sucker Punch. Well, will the streak of great productions from Zack Snyder continue? Well, you'll just have to tune in. For that, look back at Zack. Thank you for watching and listening. Say, why not like and subscribe? And check out that link description below. That'll take you to my many stores that have plenty of goodies for you. Oh yeah, and also down in that link description, you'll find a link to my BitChute channel, where is another place you can find my videos because, well, once again, there are dark clouds swirling about YouTube, and you just never know, do you? No, you never do. So, do check me out at BitChute.